and we put them in front of a leadership team we had not coached or trained. It was just like a car crash in slow motion. It was the most painful thing to see.
Welcome to Lean Stories. I'm Jonathan Burfield. I'm the CEO at Lean Startup Co. And this is where we dive deep with practitioners from around the world who've discovered the transformative power of the Lean Startup methodology. In each episode, you'll hear authentic stories from product leaders and innovators across industries and geographies, how they've discovered the Lean principles and the pivotal moments that change their approach and the real-world impact of putting customers at the center of everything that they build. In the notes below, you'll find information about our guest and getting in touch with Lean Startup Co. In this conversation, I'm speaking with Susie Braam, a former UK national security leader who built one of the government's first innovation units. We'll talk about what it takes to shift from control to curiosity, why coaching beats training for culture change, and how innovation really works inside of large public institutions. So Susie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonathan. Happy to be here.
So maybe let's just start. Tell us a little bit about, how you've been working, where you've been working, just kind of a high level. And just if you can pick out, what were some of the career moments that really helped get you to the place where you are today?
I guess let's rewind about 10 to 12 years. I would never imagine to be in the place I am today. So my background, I spent over 20 years working in the UK national security sector for government. And the first half of that career was very much doing frontline operations. And that's about as much as I can say about that. And then, it was around just over 10 years ago when a director I'd worked with before on operations, this guy is a kind of a Marmite character. People loved him or hated him. But definitely quite a visionary for the organization. And he had this idea that he wanted to set up a new unit inside our agency to effectively be more kind of innovative, creative, and strategic about how we did operational capability development. And he asked me to lead on innovation. And my response to him was, I think you've got the wrong person. I can't even draw a stick figure, was what I said, because at that point, in my mind, innovation equated to creativity, which equated to being able to draw, which in my head now just makes me, I feel like, oh my God, what an idiot. And to be fair, he looked at me like an idiot and he said, Susie, I don't think that's what it's about. I thought, okay. And he gave me what I honestly think is probably the greatest gift anyone's ever given me in my life, in that he gave me this job and he said, I don't want to see anything from you for 6 months. I want you to go learn. And so out I came from behind the wire into this big wide world, like Bambi, like my eyes, like blinking wide into the light. And I kind of sucked up as much as I could. I went to conferences, I read, I went to organizations in government, private sector organizations to learn, like, well, what does innovation mean? How are you doing it? Like, what's working, what isn't? And trying to figure out, well, what would this mean in our context and with what we're trying to do? And over that 6 months, I got all the buzzwords, but I still kind of application was still like, oh, I don't really know how to do this. And that's kind of how I started in it. I think from like the first year or maybe even 18 months, I was still like, okay, I've kind of heard about incubators and I've heard about accelerators and I've heard about lean startup and I've heard about design thinking. And I'm like, well, what do we do where and how do I incorporate all this? So it was kind of trying to figure out like, okay, how do I apply this now into our specific context? And that was the beginning of like how I got into this. And since then, I did that role. I did a second role in another agency as head of innovation for 3 years, which was quite different in flavour. And I spent 4.5 years working as part of a senior leadership team on a big digital transformation project for government. And I've been consulting, advising on innovation for about the last 4 years now. And I guess my sweet spot is where kind of strategy overlaps with leadership and innovation. And somewhere there in the middle is where I really like to play.
So if innovation isn't drawing stick figures, right? What have you learned that helps you define what it is at this point in your journey? Like, do you have a better definition than not boring six figures?
I do. I've learned I'm also creative, despite the fact that I can't draw. So that's been a journey. I've also learned you don't necessarily have to be the most naturally creative person to lead innovation. Like they're different skills, right? But yeah, innovation. So I define innovation really simply, in that for me, it is anything new that adds value. So it has to be added value, like better than what we had, or something completely new to what we had. And yeah, it's something new. And it can, for me, it can be anything, obviously technology, but tools, product, processes, policy, even, like, can be anything. And again, like for me, there's that extreme. There's from the kind of continuous improvement to, okay, we're going to introduce like a new policy that makes, I don't know, a procurement process, for example, faster, easier, more user-friendly, to something absolutely like groundbreaking that fundamentally changes the way like society and we function, and everything in between. But for me, yeah, I keep it as simple as possible. Anything new that creates value.
So you've got this moment in time, the door opens, right? The leader who nominated you to take that first role. What was in your mind during that journey that led you to understand the ways that we've been doing whatever it is that we were doing, building product, building services, developing solutions for different types of users, wasn't going to cut it with the types of requests that you were dealing with the types of solutions that you were being asked to solve for? So what was it that said, hey, I think we need a different approach, and I understand these new tools, these new mindset shifts are going to help?
The way we were doing things didn't work well, right? There's so much waste in the system, and stuff being kind of developed and created, not necessarily like, that would have the biggest impact, not necessarily like the highest priority. Things being created kind of for quite bespoke purposes that could have much wider application that we kind of weren't seeing and weren't using. But this was a pushback I got a lot. Like, well, how do you know this is going to be better? How do you know lean startup approach will be better and work better? And my answer was like, well, I don't, but it's not working now, right? What have you got to lose, frankly, by trying this? And like, we can point so easily to so much waste in the system, spending so much of people's time and energy and money and stuff that ultimately just wasn't delivering impact. The impact that we needed, that we owed to kind of public finances. For me, it was just like this looks like something that could work, and it made logical sense to me. One of the things that I did speak to, this director about down the line was like, why did you ask me to take that role? And I think there were two qualities he described in me that he saw, and they've been qualities I've looked for in other people. And one is curiosity. He's like, you're curious, like you want to know why all the time. And I think that sort of was fundamental. Like, I'm going to ask, well, why are we doing things like that? Why can't we do this differently? Like, why wouldn't that work? Or why does this work? And I think there was that. And then the second thing was just my openness to learning, my openness to trying something different, So like, originally my reaction when he said, innovation, I was like, no, I don't think that's me. But he was like, I think it could be, go see. I was like, okay. Like, I was immediately open to just learning. And I think, that's the approach with all of this for me. It's like, there's always a better way. Like, I can always be better. Like, everything can always be better. Like, we can always improve, and sometimes, yeah, things are good enough. It is fine. But like, it's kind of like, well, if there is a better way, like, why wouldn't we take it?
Yeah. When did you stumble upon, or when did you actually generate intentionally first moment, which was like, all right, see, this is evidence inside of government, inside of the kinds of work that we do, that we can do this and it delivers impact?
So I think it's important to say, I think I spent the first 2.5 to 3 years in that first role wasting a lot of energy and effort trying to convince people who were never going to be convinced that this was something worth doing. What I learned from that and did much better in my second head of innovation role was figure out, well, who are my early adopters in the organization of this way of working. And I remember it being an opportunity. They'd recently set up kind of the equivalent of lines of business effectively. And this was going to be a new way of working for them. And the head of one of the lines of business, they would be responsible for both the delivery of today's capability, but also the future health of that capability, and figuring out like how they needed to innovate to maintain that. And he came to me and he said, I know how to deliver like today. I don't know how to do like maintain its health and make sure I'm doing the innovation piece. And please, can I have your help with that? And that was the first time I think I was really like, this is it. This is my early adopter, because he has a problem. He knows he has a problem here and he's actively sourcing a solution for it. And he is open, to what I can share with him to help him with this. And working with him to figure out, so we worked with him then to build an innovation strategy, to work with him on developing a portfolio, and how to then sort of manage that pipeline of stuff that was coming through his innovation portfolio, to put sort of governance in process, build a leadership team that was going to be able to make decisions and stage gates and all of that great stuff. And it was great to work with him to sort of figure out, okay, we've got these ideas about how this could work. A lot of that was working with the Lean Startup Company actually back then, and you helped us a lot to bring a lot of that in. But it was like, how are we going to work this in your context? And he was open to kind of figuring that out with us.
Open to starting on that journey and open to embracing it. Did it lead to impact in an appropriate time frame that you could then leverage to start spreading the word beyond that particular initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. So he was our kind of poster child, really, our case study. And he would advocate then to other senior leaders of other lines of business on the approach. And, what it enabled him to do. So one of the first things we discovered in the first kind of workshop with him, when we kind of did some portfolio mapping with him, was there was an enormous amount of money being spent in R&D kind of in his name, effectively related to his capability, which he had no visibility of and did not relate necessarily to his strategic objectives. And he thought he had nothing in his innovation portfolio. It turns out there was loads being done there. He just had no idea it was. And so being able to kind of visualize that, and that was really powerful to say, to kind of showcase that as an example, like, there's all this money being spent in this area. We've now sort of looked at how do we redirect that onto like, what are the strategic priorities for this area? One thing we did, I'd say, though, struggle with, and this was quite interesting, and this is for me, like the continual leadership challenge is, we kind of set up a growth board, a board that decides which innovation ideas they want to invest in and take forward, and which ones they want to stop. And we did some coaching with the people who were making those decisions, and they were very open at first, but we kind of got to a point where actually they sort of started to kind of go, actually, like, we kind of want to do this ourselves. And what was really interesting to observe was they didn't always want to be held accountable to the discipline, right? There was still a kind of, I know I'm supposed to be led by the evidence, and I know I'm supposed to stay open-minded, I know I'm supposed to ask these questions at this time, but I kind of want it to go like this. And so okay for coaching now. And I think that was one of the things, like the last kind of hurdle that I think struggled to sort of overcome a bit, and sort of keep trying to get back in there and push the discipline and help kind of leaders recognize like what was helpful or unhelpful about their behaviors.
It's so persistent because the people who are at that table with the leadership title and with that authority, they got there by knowing the answers, right? And so if now we're coming along and say, hey, actually, your job is to ask the right questions and receive the evidence from the team who are closest to the customer, closest to the problem. That's a huge challenge. Were there any kind of moments where you remember, when we said this, it really helped them, or when they saw this kind of moment that shifted their dynamic? Did you ever get past that with that group?
With that specific group, I'd say not actually. There was another group. We had a similar portfolio, actually, really interestingly, in an HR function. which I think is quite unusual. But yeah, the HR kind of department came to us and they said, like, we'd like to do something similar to this and, develop an innovation portfolio and have a growth board. Can you help us set it up? Now, I don't know, they were kind of more coachable, I would say, and that perhaps it was kind of the open-mindedness to learning and reflection a little bit on what was being helpful and unhelpful about their behaviours. I mean, storytelling was helpful, and I think sharing the impact of both positive and negative leadership behaviours on teams was quite helpful. And there's a story I still tell to this day because it's one of those ones that stuck with me personally. It was actually in the previous role when we'd run an incubator, and I had the most awesome little innovation team that was working on behavioural analytics, and they were all selected for their kind of subject matter expertise, like world class in their areas. And we spent, a whole week kind of immersing them in lean startup methodology and building them as, their team dynamics. And they did 6 weeks of awesome discovery work, and we put them in front of a leadership team we had not coached or trained. And it was just like a car crash in slow motion. It was the most painful thing to see. And I ended up having to close that meeting early and ask the team to kind of leave before they were even more bruised. And yeah, afterwards I went in to see them, and oh my goodness, they were so dejected. Like half the team kind of quit. And it was like, well, this is such a lost opportunity because of how the leadership behaved. We've lost the incredible minds and thinking of these people. Like they don't want to be part of this because they don't feel heard or listened to. And so kind of telling stories like that and how what impact that can have, did help people realize, okay, I really need to sort myself out here. And if this is something I'm struggling with, I need to be open to coaching on it. But yeah, it's a continual challenge, I think.
How have you seen that mindset shift play out in the kinds of non-open and fairly rigid environments inside of government that you've been operating in? What was the spark for changing that, and how did it show itself?
That absolutely is something that takes time, and for me, that's where working with early adopters who are open to this, and it's not stuff they've learned, do you know what I mean? And so this was that realization for me with that, car crash incident I sort of told you about, was I had made this assumption that, leaders reach a sort of certain senior level of seniority and they can just do all this automatically. And it was such a false assumption, as you said, they've kind of grown up in an organization to behave and be a certain way. And then I was asking them to do something really quite different. And of course, that's not going to be easy. Plus, some people have a sort of natural predisposition, I think I had that curiosity and open to learningness. That's not everyone, right? And so, finding, again, I think working with those people, and they would often self-select, to be perfectly honest, in terms of I want to do this. So you kind of already got a bit of an open door that you're pushing at. But, those who even kind of are open-minded enough and have the humility to sort of think, okay, maybe the approach I have been using isn't best suited to this, and I can recognize and learn the difference. Working with those people would be helpful. So the other thing around this was we did a lot of training on this, right? So we would run kind of entrepreneurial kind of leadership courses. And this was both about tools and processes, but it was also about behaviors and mindset. And what we repeatedly found was leaders would come on that and they'd nod along to it all, the vast majority. Some people, you'd always get some people who would just be like, no. But the vast majority would nod along. And it's yeah, this makes total sense. This is what I need to be doing. But then back in the context of their day-to-day and the organizational culture, it was really hard. So things like protecting their innovation teams, right? So they don't get dragged into the core business. Not rushing too prematurely towards a solution when, they were still in exploratory mode. These were things that kind of, yes, it makes sense, but in the context of our culture, that's not what we reward still. As a leader, finding the courage to kind of take the heat off those innovation teams was quite difficult, and to not default to kind of just pushing that pressure down. And, for us, the answer to that was coaching. And that's when we kind of got to this position where it's actually with the resource we've got, we can outsource some of this training. What we really need to do is be there with these people to coach, because that's where we can build kind of the trust and really help them day to day. And when they're kind of, confronted with these situations like, well, my boss is asking me for this, but I kind of know the team needs this from me. Like, talk me through this. So being there really to literally hold their hand, in terms of like, how do I do something that feels countercultural, even though I know it's probably the right thing to do. So helping people kind of walk through that.
I actually think that's a really hard skill to develop as a coach, to be able to be reactive in the moment, right? When you're dealing with things like innovation and these startup practices, right? Because you've got to pull from so many different elements that are both kind of structured and unstructured, right? Like it's a big challenge in those one-on-one conversations to be able to add the appropriate kind of value in the moment with often a senior leader.
I think, depending on as well on sort of the type of person. I mean, I know for me, like I love a framework. It really helps me sort of structure my thinking. And so, that sort of right thing at the right time, my preference would be, if I'm coaching someone and a certain challenge comes up, like, oh, now there's actually a tool that could help you with this, whether it's about how you think, how you plan what you're going to say, whatever it is, so let's introduce that at this time and actually apply it together. That would always be my preference, I think, to work that way.
You mentioned another word in there. Let's pull on that thread about culture. Is culture and mindset, they're the same for you?
No, not quite. So for me, culture is behavior. It's the behaviors that are rewarded and incentivized. So yeah, culture for me is behaviors. Mindset, I guess, is more internal. Maybe behavior is the external manifestation of what's of the mindset. Perhaps I've never quite thought about it like that, but yeah, maybe that would be how I would describe it. But yeah, I think the mindset is what's going on internally, your internal dialogue. It's, can I be okay with this level of uncertainty? Can I hold that tension between where I think we need to go and where we are now? Can I stay curious? Can I ask the right question? Can I not push too quickly to a solution if I'm feeling uncomfortable with this? I think that is, am I okay if it doesn't work? Am I going to be okay if we have to iterate to something I didn't expect? Like, that's all kind of internal dialogue, I think. Culture is then how I behave.
Do you teach the organizations and the individuals who you're working with to kind of go to that script in those challenging moments?
Yeah, so what we tend to talk about are the behaviors, first of all, that are helpful, that enable innovation to thrive and innovators to thrive. And the counter behaviors. And then we tend to ask them to reflect which of those feel more comfortable or less comfortable for them. Which do they feel both confident and competent in, and where do they feel less? And then we try to encourage some kind of internal inquiry as to why is that? And exactly what is that narrative that's going on in my head? So, one of the things that people often say they struggle with is protecting the space for innovation. So both in terms of protecting time and resource and not dragging it back into the core business, they find that really difficult behavior. And similarly, not prematurely rushing to a solution, keeping that exploratory space open. And like the mindset, I guess, behind that, like what is going on for you? Why are you finding that difficult? It is often because of the pressure that's coming. And it might be perceived, it might not even be real pressure, but perceived pressure that is coming down on them from above to have a solution quickly, regardless of whether it's the right one or not. Yep. The pressure to respond to today as a priority over tomorrow. It might be real, but it might be perceived. And like, I am uncomfortable, and I'm uncomfortable kind of taking the heat there or saying no to my boss, and ultimately, like, this is going to impact my career. Like, have I got the courage to do this? Do you know what I mean? Like, those are like quite big questions, and for me, like, leadership is all about courage, and it's really hard. And there are two types: leaders that do the right thing and because it's the right thing to do for their people, and leaders who do the right thing for how they're perceived above, right? And like, what type of leader do you want to be? And this starts to then boil down to quite existential questions about who you are and what sort of person you want to be. But yeah, we do encourage that level of thinking because, in all honesty, Jonathan, it's not the right space for everyone to play, right? And I'd rather, if that's really not your space and this, your mindset is so far away from this, it's probably better you don't lead innovation, right? I don't think everyone can do this, right? You're probably going to be awesome at managing a delivery project. Go be awesome and do that. And it's the same with people who do the innovation, not just lead it. But I don't subscribe, and I've heard this a lot. Innovation is the day job. Everyone has to innovate, and I don't subscribe to that. I think we'd have chaos if everyone did do that. And I like to see people play to their strengths. I think everything can be nurtured and we can all be better at everything, but I really like to see people play to their strengths.
Is chaos the enemy of innovation?
No. One question I ask a lot and I see is a lot of organizations can innovate in situations of chaos, or what's a better word? Extreme pressure. Do you know what I mean? When something's really gone wrong, crisis situation effectively. And when I ask them why, it's because so much of the bureaucracy and the layers get removed. Right? You've got all of a sudden the people who need to make the decisions available, making decisions quickly. It tends to be why we can innovate in crisis and not in steady state. And that is sort of a symptom of what is wrong with the system and what about the system is set up to sort of disable innovation in that steady state, and how can we replicate, what do we need to design for innovation in the system to enable us to move faster? What's blocking that?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Matt Fonte from who we both know from the US government, he talks about being able to operate as though there is a crisis when there isn't, right? And so some of that tends to be about removing those layers of bureaucracy, but it's also about moving with an urgency, right? Rather than just kind of leaning back and it'll all be fine. It's no, we need to move quickly now, even though there isn't necessarily a crisis in play at that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and two things for that. One thing for me is pushing decisions down. So that's where strategy has got to be super clear. Strategic direction has got to be super clear. So as that with the strategic direction, then those lower down who are closer actually to the information can make the right decision in the strategic context. I think that's really important.
So what's your perspective on that? I know you've done work both in the government and in the private sector. So do you see a difference that's meaningful between those two spaces? Do you see that I tend to think of it as an excuse, it's a crutch teams lean into to say, well, really you shouldn't have high expectations for us, right? Rather than saying, regardless of what the dynamics are, we're going to push through and we're going to achieve excellence and, really deliver impact. So, do you have a similar perspective? Do you push back against that?
I share your perspective, Jonathan. Yeah, I mean, I guess in some quite unusual government contexts, but I've also worked, with a range of private sector, industries, and I honestly think everyone thinks they're special and different, and I just don't buy it. And I don't see how it's helpful. I don't see how it helps an organization progress or adopt kind of good practice or helps them achieve their outcomes. I don't see how that thinking helps, particularly in any way. I would always be looking at what can I learn from elsewhere. Obviously I've worked in, highly regulated, risk-averse environments, and there are others that would be comparable to that, like banking perhaps, or insurance, healthcare, I think to some extent, lots in that area. There might be more consideration, so there might be more departments with kind of a perspective on things that you need to engage earlier. So perhaps there's a little more complexity at times, but ultimately I don't see how the process is different. Engaging those stakeholders early, having someone there. So one of the things I did in one of my head of innovation roles was all of those areas which you might traditionally see as blockers to innovation. So things like compliance, legal, for us, the security department, commercial, where there was really strict kind of regulations around like who we could and couldn't kind of engage in work outside of the organization. I kind of went to the heads of all those areas and I said, I want someone on the hook for innovation in your areas, right? So it becomes part of their job objective to enable innovation. So they're no longer there just to make sure things are secure. Their job objective is also to make sure that they support and enable innovation. And like they have to achieve that outcome alongside the security. And I want you to hold them accountable to that. And so then I could have a point of contact in each of those areas who I could, we could bring them into the fold, help them to really understand, like, well, what is innovation? Like, what is the outcome I'm trying to achieve? And this was a big mindset shift, yeah. And then shifting my mindset from, well, I'm just here to make sure everything is secure. I'm here to make sure everything is compliant to, I'm also here to achieve an outcome, a mission outcome, like with regards to innovation. How can I help them do that in a secure and compliant way? And so thinking more creatively rather than just like, no, this is the process, so you have to follow this. It's like, how can I design something new that helps you achieve your outcome? So starting to build that in much more to the system.
What I'm hearing you say is that we're special, we're a snowflake, right? Sometimes that does demand different solutions, right? It demands a different approach to be able to reflect on that. One of the ways that I saw that happening in the banking world, where there's somebody from in a regulatory role, often like a legal counsel, whose job is it to say no, right? That's their focus, right? Is to say no. That's their job, is to say no, like as often as possible, right? And so bringing them into that process early, giving them maybe that same role that you were just describing from a security perspective, right? It's taking a little bit of creativity to find, well, how do we unlock that uniqueness and turn it into a strength rather than to be a barrier that it's impossible for us to get through.
The leader's role there is that alignment, the alignment about the shared outcome, because too often we're working to different drivers and outcomes, which we shouldn't be, right? And we lose sight of that. So I do feel that's important. In terms of adapting things and thinking about, lean startup methodology particularly, I guess the only thing I have particularly found helpful to sometimes adapt is language. So there's certain, and even this I've been a little bit resistant to, but there's no doubt that there's certain language that can like just not resonate at all with certain organizations for whatever reason. So, back in government and national security, I frequently got objection to the word customer. And I would often get someone very snooty say to me, we do not have customers, we have partners. And it was like, I think you do have customers. Anyway, but there was no point me pushing that, if it was going to put up a wall. Do you know what I mean? And so figuring out, okay, who have I got in front of me here? How are they going to perceive this? And I don't want to use language that's just immediately going to put the wall up. What I would still do, so we often then would talk about kind of beneficiaries, right, instead of customers or potentially end users, depending on what type of innovation you were talking about. And again, though, like we would sort of then try to bring in some of the kind of customer mindset still. So it'd still be, well, who are your main beneficiaries? Who are you creating value for? What is the value? What are the outcomes they're looking for? So you're kind of asking, I'm thinking customer, customer, customer. I'm just using a word that doesn't put their back up and which will just increase their openness to what it is I kind of want them to think about. So I think that would be the main place, was just some language, and I saw different things in other organizations, like it's just like almost like an allergic reaction to a certain word. And it's like, fine, I'm not going to die in a ditch over this word. Let's use what makes sense and what resonates.
Yeah. No, we see it a lot with companies that don't want to think of themselves as a product organization. So if you use the word product, it has that similar, like, people coming out in hives because they're upset because, and it's like, okay, let's call it the thing that you want to call it, right? Doesn't change the process of let's learn, let's iterate, let's deliver something that is backed up by evidence, right? Regardless of the words that we use.
Yeah. Even
Uh,
innovation, Jonathan. So I remember a social housing organisation saying to me, like, oh, we've dabbled with innovation and it didn't go well, and now it's got a really bad name, and I can't even say the word innovation. And I was like, well, don't. This is innovation is really about solving problems in a better way. It's about seizing opportunities and creating value. Just talk about that. Don't use the word innovation. If that's going to just put people's backs up.
Let's just, as we're wrapping up, where do you think your practice as a lean startup coach and trainer and facilitator, where is it heading? What's starting to emerge as some new tools, some new practices? Like, what do you think's in the future for you as you work with organizations driving innovation and using these methods?
Yeah, so I think that brings me back to my holy trinity, in all honesty, of innovation combined with strategy and leadership. As I guess things have become more and more uncertain and the economic climate isn't as good as it was, innovation is suffering for sure. It's getting closed down. Budgets are narrowing. And I think this is classic because we tend to double down on like what we already do when we kind of feel pressured and things feel tight. It feels uncomfortable and high risk to be doing something new in those situations. And this is for me where we have to make sure that any innovation activity aligns super closely like with key strategic priorities. And like if we can show how we can create value to shift an organization along on those key strategic objectives, that for me is the way ahead, and helping those leadership that are still open to that to protect that, to provide that strategic guidance, to develop a portfolio approach with different risk profiles within it, to find ways to tell the stories, to show the progress, to show the impact. Like that's where it's got to be. But I guess that's exactly what I see. I see people kind of closing down when, I wrote this article once, when more money and people can't be the answer or something like that, because we can't always just keep throwing more and more and more when we're being asked to do more and more and more, right? The money and people are finite most of the time. And for me, like innovation is our only way out of it. But how do we show that? So I think that's what I see.
Oh, this is a great conversation, Susie. Really appreciate your transparency, and like the depth of your experience just shines through. So thank you so much for sharing your stories.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Jonathan.
That was such a fun conversation. And I hope it sparked a few ideas for you as well. So if you're thinking, I'd love to see how this could work in my startup or with my team, let's talk. I genuinely enjoy these kind of conversations, and there's no pressure, no pitch, just 15 minutes for us to chat and explore the opportunities together. So grab a time with me using the link below. I'd love to hear your story.